The first thing Randall McCoy heard wasn't the gunshot. It was the crackle. January 1st, 1888, 2 a.m. The Appalachian Mountains are buried under a foot of snow. The temperature is hovering near zero. Inside the small timber cabin, the fire in the hearth has long died down to embers. Randall, his wife Sarah, and their children are asleep, huddled under thick quilts, trying to preserve the day's warmth. Then, the sound. It's a sharp, dry snap, like a twig breaking, but amplified 100 times. Then another, and another. Randall opens his eyes, his breath misting in the freezing air. He smells it before he sees it. The acrid, choking scent of pine wood turning to charcoal. Smoke. He throws the covers off, and his feet hit the icy floorboards. He looks toward the roof. It is glowing orange. Someone is on the roof, and they are pouring oil onto the shingles. Panic is a cold sensation, colder than the winter air. Randall grabs his rifle from the wall. He screams for his family to wake up. Sarah grabs the little ones. The older children, Calvin and Alifair, stumble out of bed, eyes wide with the confusion of deep sleep torn apart by terror. "Come out, Randall!" The voice comes from outside. It's muffled by the wind and the roar of the fire that is now eating the ceiling, but the tone is unmistakable. It's not a request. It's a hunt. Randall cracks the door open just an inch. A bullet slams into the wood frame, sending splinters flying into his face. He slams it shut. They are surrounded. Think about this moment. You are trapped in a wooden box. Above you, the roof is melting into liquid fire. Outside, a dozen men with Winchester rifles are waiting for a silhouette to appear in the doorway. If you stay, you burn. If you run, you die. The heat becomes unbearable. The smoke descends like a black curtain, filling the lungs, stinging the eyes. The children are coughing, crying. Sarah looks at Randall. There is no plan. There is no police to call. In 1888, in the deep hollows of the Tug Fork Valley, there is no 911. There is only the fire, and the men waiting in the dark. Randall makes a decision. He knows they want him. If he can draw their fire, maybe, just maybe, the others can slip into the shadows. He smashes a window at the back of the house. The glass shatters into the snow. He dives. Gunshots erupt from the tree line. The snow around him kicks up in tiny explosions of dirt and ice. He scrambles on his hands and knees, tearing his clothes on the frozen brush, sprinting toward the cornfield. He runs until his lungs burn, until the screams of his family fade into the distance, replaced by the howling wind. He survives. He spends the night shivering in a haystack, frostbite gnawing at his fingers, listening to his home crackle and collapse in the distance. But he was the lucky one. Because back at the cabin, the shooting didn't stop when Randall left. When his daughter Alifair tried to flee the flames, she wasn't met with mercy. She was met with a bullet. When his wife Sarah tried to reach her dying child, a rifle butt came down on her head with such force it cracked her skull. When the sun rose on New Year's Day, nothing remained of the McCoy home but a pile of smoking ash and blackened chimney stones. The snow around the ruins was stained dark red. This sounds like a scene from a war movie, a raid by a hostile army on an enemy outpost. But this wasn't war. This was something far more personal. The men who lit the torches weren't foreign soldiers. They were neighbors. They were men Randall had grown up with, men he had traded with, men who lived just across the river. They didn't come to arrest him. They came to wipe his bloodline off the face of the earth. The flames of that cabin illuminated a tragedy so dark it became American folklore. But as the smoke cleared, the truth began to twist. If you say Hatfield and McCoy to an average American today, they don't picture a burning house or a mother weeping over her child's body. They picture a cartoon. They picture two bearded hillbillies in floppy hats, holding jugs of moonshine, shooting at each other because they're stupid, because they're savages. It's the punchline of 1,000 jokes. It's on Looney Tunes. It's on Family Guy. It's a brand of hot sauce. It's a dinner theater attraction in Tennessee. We have turned one of the most brutal episodes of American history into a comedy routine. Why? Because it's easier. It's easier to dismiss the violence if we convince ourselves that these people were just backward simpletons who didn't know any better. Oh, those crazy hillbillies fighting over nothing. But here is the reality check. This wasn't a fight over nothing. And these men weren't idiots. To understand why a dozen men surrounded a cabin on New Year's Eve with the intent to slaughter a family, we have to look at the map. This story takes place in the Tug Fork Valley. It's a rugged, winding slice of the Appalachian Mountains. The Tug Fork River snakes right through the middle, acting as a natural border. On one bank you have Kentucky, on the other, West Virginia. Today, crossing a state line means passing a green metal sign on the highway. Maybe the asphalt changes color. That's it. But in the late 1800s, this river was a political fault line. West Virginia was a brand new state, born out of the Civil War, trying to establish its own laws and identity. Kentucky was the old guard. The river separated two different legal systems, two different governors, and two different ways of life. And living on both sides of this river weren't just random peasants. They were the titans of the valley. The Hatfields and the McCoys weren't poor. Let's get that myth out of the way right now. William Anderson Hatfield, known to history as Devil Anse, wasn't scratching a living out of the dirt. He was a timber mogul. He ran a massive logging operation. He employed dozens of men. He floated thousands of logs down that river to the industrial markets. In today's money, Devil Anse was a millionaire. He was closer to a CEO than a hillbilly. He had political connections, he had land, and he had power. Randall McCoy, on the Kentucky side, wasn't quite as wealthy, but he was respectable. He was a substantial landowner with a large farm and livestock. He was related to local judges and sheriffs. These were the aristocrats of the Tug Valley. They were the kings of their respective banks. So, erase the image of the drunken fool with a shotgun. Replace it with the image of two powerful patriarchs, two mob bosses essentially, staring at each other across a narrow river. They were smart, they were proud, and they were heavily armed. But most importantly, they were traumatized. Because before they were enemies, they were soldiers. And the war they fought didn't end when the surrender papers were signed. To understand the feud, you can't start with the pig. You have to start with the blood that was spilled long before the first lawsuit was ever filed. Before they were enemies, William Anderson Devil, Anse Hatfield and Randolph Randall McCoy were allies, brothers in arms. When the Civil War ripped the United States in two, it didn't just divide North and South. It divided states. It divided towns. It divided families. The Tug Valley was ground zero for this kind of intimate conflict. Kentucky officially stayed with the Union, but many of its men, like Randall McCoy, went to fight for the Confederacy. West Virginia, newly broken off from Virginia, was a Union state, but its rugged terrain was a hornet's nest of Confederate sympathizers like Devil Anse Hatfield. It was a war fought in whispers and ambushes, not on grand battlefields. Devil Anse was a natural leader in this kind of fight. He was a mountain of a man, tall and broad-shouldered with a presence that commanded respect and fear. His nickname, they say, came from his own mother, who claimed he was as fearless as the devil himself. He led a Confederate guerrilla unit called the Logan Wildcats. Their job wasn't to win the war, it was to make life hell for any Union patrols that dared to enter their territory. And for a time, Randall McCoy fought right alongside men like Anse. He was older, more reserved, but just as tough. He was a devout man, known for his stubborn pride and a memory that never ever let go of a slight. Think about that for a second. The two men whose names would become synonymous with eternal hatred once shared a campfire. They once aimed their rifles in the same direction. They were fighting for the same cause. But then, something changed. In 1863, Randall McCoy did something that, in the eyes of Devil Anse and his men, was unforgivable. He left. He switched sides. He enlisted in the Union Army. We don't know why. Maybe he was captured and forced to switch. Maybe he saw the tide of the war turning and made a practical decision. Maybe he had a crisis of conscience. The reason is lost to history. But the result was not. To the Logan Wildcats, Randall wasn't a soldier changing allegiance. He was a traitor. He had turned his back on his own people. Imagine what that does to a community. The man you trusted yesterday is wearing the enemy's uniform today. How can you ever trust anyone again? So when the war officially ended in 1865 and the soldiers returned from the battlefields of Virginia and Tennessee, they didn't come home to peace. They came home to a simmering pot of resentment. They laid down their official army rifles, but they kept their personal ones. They took off their blue and gray uniforms, but they never forgot who wore which color. They were neighbors again, forced to trade and interact at the local market, all while carrying the memory that just a year ago, they were trying to kill each other in the woods. The war had taught these men a very specific lesson. When the law fails, you take it into your own hands. And the government, tired of war, was more than happy to just leave them alone. The country moved on. But the Tug Valley did not. The grudges, the betrayals, the memories of violence, they were all still there, buried just under the surface, like a landmine waiting for a single misstep. And that first misstep would come from a man who wore the Union blue, a ghost of the war who came walking home a little too late. The story of the feud truly begins not with an argument, but with a quiet murder on a cold trail, a killing that would cast a shadow over the families for the next 20 years. The man's name was Asa Harmon McCoy. He was Randall's younger brother. Unlike Randall, Harmon hadn't switched sides. He was a Union man from the start. He'd fought for the North for 4 years and returned home in 1865, just weeks after the war ended. But when he came home, he didn't get a hero's welcome. He got a death threat. While Harmon was away fighting for the Union, Devil Anse Hatfield's most trusted lieutenant and his uncle had been running the Logan Wildcats. His name was Jim Vance. And if Devil Anse was the calculating CEO, Jim Vance was the ruthless enforcer. Vance was a hard man in a hard country. He was older, with a long white beard and eyes that had seen too much violence. He held a grudge like a religion. And in his eyes, Asa Harmon McCoy wasn't just a neighbor on the wrong side of the war. He was a personal insult. A Union man, a McCoy, living right there in their backyard. Unacceptable. A message was sent to Harmon. Stay away from the West Virginia side of the river, or else. Harmon, a combat veteran, wasn't a man who scared easily. He ignored the threat, but he was smart enough to be cautious. He began spending his nights hiding in a nearby cave, not wanting to put his family in danger. One cold January day, he went out hunting. He walked the familiar trails, the crunch of snow under his boots, the only sound. He never came back. A search party found him the next day. He had been shot, not once but multiple times, left for dead in the snow. There was no trial, no official investigation. In the chaos of the post-war era, the death of a single Union soldier in a Confederate sympathizing territory wasn't a priority for the law. But everyone knew. Everyone whispered the same name, Jim Vance. They said Vance and his raiders had tracked Harmon through the woods and executed him. It was an assassination, a final bloody act of the Civil War. Was Devil Anse involved? Did he order the hit? We'll never know for sure. He was sick in bed at the time, which gave him a perfect alibi. But it doesn't matter. His men, led by his uncle, had shed the first blood. A McCoy had been killed by a Hatfield, and there was no justice. Randall McCoy never forgot that. For him, the war wasn't over. It had just followed his brother home and murdered him in cold blood. For 13 years, this crime hung in the air between the two families. It was an unspoken tension, a deep, abiding hatred that was passed from father to son. They avoided each other. They traded with clenched jaws. They waited. For 13 years, the feud was a cold war, a silent, staring contest across the river, until one day, a farm animal wandered onto the wrong property. And that cold war was about to turn hot. It seems insane that a single hog could trigger a decades-long war that would claim a dozen lives. But to understand why, you have to understand that in Appalachia, that pig wasn't just dinner, it was survival. It's 1878. 13 years have passed since the murder of Asa Harmon McCoy. The families are locked in a cold war. Then, one day, Randall McCoy counts his pigs, and one is missing. A few days later, he sees it. On the property of his neighbor, Floyd Hatfield, a cousin of Devil Anse. Randall is certain it's his. He recognizes the distinctive notches cut into the pig's ears, a common way of marking livestock. Floyd Hatfield denies it. He says he bought the pig fair and square. Today, this would be a petty squabble. Annoying, but meaningless. But in 1878, a single hog was a family's insurance policy for the winter. That pig represented hundreds of pounds of cured meat, enough to feed a dozen children through the brutal mountain cold. It was lard for cooking, hide for leather. It was a significant financial asset. Losing that pig was like waking up to find your entire bank account had been drained. This was not a small thing. This was an accusation of grand theft. But they didn't reach for their guns. Not yet. They did what civilized people do. They went to court. Randall McCoy sued Floyd Hatfield for the value of his property. The price? $10. The trial was held in the local magistrate's court. And here's the first problem. The justice of the peace, the man who would act as judge and jury, was Anderson Hatfield, a relative of the defendant. He was known as Preacher Anse, a man of the cloth, but a Hatfield nonetheless. You are Randall McCoy. You walk into a courtroom to accuse a Hatfield of theft, and the man wearing the robe is also a Hatfield. You already feel the scales of justice tipping. The case was simple. It came down to one man's word against another. So Preacher Anse called a key witness, a man named Bill Staton. Staton was in an impossible position. He was related to both families. He was a McCoy by blood, but he was married to a Hatfield. He was caught directly in the middle. His testimony would decide the case. The courtroom was silent. All eyes were on him. Randall, convinced that blood was thicker than water, expected Staton to side with him. Staton took the stand. He looked at the pig, and he testified that he had seen it in Floyd Hatfield's possession for months. He said it was, without a doubt, a Hatfield pig. The gavel came down. Randall McCoy had lost. He was publicly humiliated. In his mind, his pig had been stolen, and the theft had been sanctioned by a corrupt, Hatfield-controlled court. He was out $10, but more importantly, he had lost his honor. He had been made to look like a fool and a liar in front of his entire community. It wasn't about the bacon. It was about the lie. The murder of his brother 13 years prior had gone unpunished by the law. Now, a simple case of theft was, in his eyes, being covered up by the same broken system. Randall walked out of that courtroom with a simmering rage, a conviction that if he wanted justice, the law wasn't going to give it to him. He would have to get it himself. The court had settled the matter of the pig, but in doing so, it had ignited a firestorm of resentment. And that firestorm was about to be fueled by the one thing more volatile than politics or money, the passions of the young. A legal dispute is one thing, but when a McCoy daughter fell in love with a Hatfield son, the conflict moved from the courtroom into the heart of the family itself, turning a feud over property into a devastating story of forbidden love. The year is 1880. It's an election day in Kentucky. In the 19th century, this wasn't just about casting a ballot. It was a massive community festival, a day of picnics, horse races, political speeches, and a whole lot of drinking. Everyone was there, including the Hatfields and the McCoys. They kept their distance, of course. A river of hostility flowed between their family camps. But the children were young and restless. Rosanna McCoy was one of Randall's daughters. She was caught in the middle of her father's bitter obsession, living in a house where the name Hatfield was a curse. And then she saw him, Johnson Hatfield, Devil Ance's eldest son, known to everyone as Johnsy. He was handsome, charming, and had a reputation as a reckless womanizer. He was the one person on earth she was supposed to hate, the prince of the rival kingdom. Their eyes met across the fairgrounds. We don't know what they said to each other. We don't know if they understood the fire they were playing with. All we know is that by the end of the day, Rosanna McCoy had made a choice that would seal her fate. She left with him. She got on the back of Johnsy's horse and rode away from her family across the Tugfork River and into the heart of Hatfield territory. You have to understand what a monumental act of rebellion this was. In this strict patriarchal society, a daughter didn't just leave her family. It was a public shaming of her father, Randall. She had abandoned her clan and willingly gone to live with the enemy. She was a traitor. Imagine what that must have been like for her. To walk into the home of Devil Ance Hatfield, the man her father despised. To sleep under the roof of the family implicated in her uncle's murder. The initial thrill of romance must have quickly given way to a terrifying reality. She was in love, yes, but she was also a hostage to that love. Devil Ance, a shrewd tactician, saw the situation for what it was. He allowed Rosanna to stay. Maybe he saw it as a victory, a way to humiliate Randall McCoy even further. The McCoy patriarch couldn't even control his own daughter. For a few weeks, a fragile peace existed. Rosanna lived among the Hatfields, desperately hoping that Johnsy would marry her and make her an official part of the family. It was her only way out. Marriage would legitimize her decision. But Johnsy was his father's son, impulsive and unreliable. He enjoyed the thrill of the forbidden romance, but the reality of being tied down to a McCoy, that was another story. Rosanna had bet her entire future on the love of a Hatfield. It was a gamble she was about to lose in the most spectacular way possible. She had given up everything for him, her home, her family, her name. The next section reveals what she got in return and how her heartbreak would lead directly to the feud's first taste of mob justice. Rosanna McCoy's dream of a new life with Johnsy Hatfield quickly curdled into a nightmare. She was living in a state of limbo. She was a McCoy in a Hatfield house, trusted by no one. And Johnsy, the man she had sacrificed everything for, refused to marry her. He was young, he was restless. The novelty of the forbidden love was wearing off, replaced by the heavy weight of responsibility. Then, Rosanna discovered she was pregnant. This should have been the moment that forced a decision. A child on the way. A marriage was now a necessity, not a choice. It was her last hope for a respectable life. But Johnsy still hesitated. And Devil Ance, his father, was against the marriage. A McCoy carrying a Hatfield heir. The bloodlines were getting too messy. The politics of it were too complicated. Heartbroken and with nowhere to go, Rosanna made the agonizing decision to leave the Hatfields. She couldn't go home. Her father, Randall, had disowned her. She found refuge with an aunt, living as a pariah, pregnant and alone. She gave up her family for him, and in return, he gave her nothing. But her story gets worse. One day, she learned that her brothers were planning to ambush Johnsy. Randall, still furious over the dishonor, had put a warrant out for Johnsy's arrest on charges of moonshining, a convenient legal excuse to get his hands on the boy who had ruined his daughter. The plan was to capture him, drag him to the jail in Kentucky, and let him rot. Rosanna was torn. The man who had abandoned her was about to be captured by the family she had abandoned. In a final, desperate act of love, or perhaps madness, she chose Johnsy. She saddled a horse and rode through the night, a Paul Revere of a broken heart, to warn the Hatfields that a McCoy posse was on its way. She saved the man who wouldn't marry her from the family that wouldn't forgive her. Devil Ants mounted a rescue party. They intercepted the McCoys and freed Jauncey. Rosanna had saved his life. And how did Jauncey repay this incredible act of loyalty? A few months later, he married another woman, Rosanna's own cousin, Nancy McCoy. He didn't just abandon her, he replaced her with another member of her own family. It was the ultimate soul-crushing betrayal. Rosanna's baby was born, but the child died in infancy. Within a few years, Rosanna herself, broken by grief and illness, would also be dead. Her tragic story is often just a footnote in the Feud, the Romeo and Juliet part. But it was so much more. It was the emotional kindling. Randall McCoy had lost his brother, lost a court case, and now he had lost his daughter to the deceit of a Hatfield. The bitterness was no longer just about politics or property. It was now deeply, painfully personal. The next time a Hatfield and a McCoy met on a hot summer day, all it would take was a drunken insult to turn all that pain into pure, unadulterated violence. The next major flashpoint would once again be an election day. But this time, the dispute wouldn't be settled with a secret romance, it would be settled with a knife. August 1882. The Kentucky heat is suffocating. The air is thick with humidity, dust, and the sour smell of cheap whiskey. Once again, the clans have gathered for an election, but the festive atmosphere of 2 years prior is gone. Now, there's a hard edge to every glance, a challenge in every voice. The betrayal of Rosanna McCoy is a fresh wound, and everyone is waiting for it to be salted. It starts, as these things often do, with a stupid argument over a small debt. Talbot McCoy, one of Randall's sons, confronts Ellison Hatfield, Devil Ance's brother. Ellison was a giant, a powerful man known for his strength and temper. Talbot, fueled by whiskey and family rage, felt brave. An argument over the price of a fiddle turns into an insult. The insult turns into a shove. And then, all the years of resentment explode. Ellison lands the first punch. It's a brutal, heavy blow that sends Talbot staggering. Ellison is on him in a second, a bear of a man overpowering a boy. Seeing their brother being beaten, 2 other McCoy sons, Farmer and Randolph Jr., jump in. Suddenly, it's 3 against 1. The crowd forms a circle, shouting. It's no longer a fight, it's a mob beating. Then someone pulls a knife. In the chaos of fists and feet, Talbot McCoy, pinned to the ground, reaches into his pocket. The blade flashes in the afternoon sun. He drives it into Ellison's side. Once, twice. He keeps stabbing, a frenzy of panicked violence. 26 times. The crowd gasps. The fighting stops. Ellison Hatfield, bleeding from dozens of wounds, stumbles backward. He's mortally wounded, but not dead yet. He pulls a rock and throws it, a final act of defiance. Then a gunshot cracks through the air. One of the McCoys fires a pistol. The bullet hits Ellison in the back. He collapses into the dirt. For a moment, there is dead silence. The only sound is the ragged breathing of the McCoy boys and the groans of the man dying at their feet. They are covered in dust and blood. Their whiskey courage has vanished, replaced by the ice-cold certainty of what they have just done. They haven't just killed a man. They have stabbed and shot the brother of Devil Anse Hatfield in front of 100 witnesses. This time, the law acts immediately. Local constables rush in, grabbing the 3 blood-soaked McCoy boys. They are arrested on the spot for murder. It seems for a fleeting moment that justice will be handled by the courts. They tie the brothers together and start marching them toward the county seat in Pikeville, where a jail cell and a judge are waiting. But they never made it. Because as the lawman led the prisoners away, a rider was already galloping across the river, carrying the news to West Virginia. Devil Anse now knew his brother was dying, and the law had his killers. But Anse Hatfield had his own idea of justice. The constables believed they were escorting 3 prisoners to jail. They were about to realize they were actually the temporary guards in a high-stakes hostage negotiation. and Devil Anse Hatfield was coming to collect his property. The three McCoy boys, Tolbert, Farmer, and Randolph Jr., stumbled down the dusty Kentucky road, chained together. The sun was beating down. Every step took them further from the scene of the crime and closer to the relative safety of a Pikeville jail. Every step was a prayer. They didn't get far. First, it was the sound. A low rumble, like distant thunder. Then, on a ridge ahead, a silhouette appeared on horseback. Then another, and another. Within minutes, the road in front of them was blocked. Devil Anse Hatfield and 20 of his men sat on their horses, waiting. They weren't hiding in ambush. They were just there. A wall of armed, silent men. There were no masks, no disguises. This wasn't a crime. This was an act of sovereign power. The two constables, Carmichael and Brumfield, came to a halt. They were good men doing their job. But their job description didn't include facing down a private army. They had 2 pistols between them. They were facing 20 Winchester rifles. Devil Anse rode forward slowly. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't emotional. He was calm, cold, and his eyes were locked on the 3 chained McCoys. He stopped in front of the constables. "They're my prisoners, Anse," one of the lawmen said, his voice straining to sound official. Anse looked at him, not with anger, but with something like pity. "Not anymore," he said, his voice low and even. The constables were outmanned, outgunned, and out of options. To resist would be suicide. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a surrender. Anse laid out his terms. His terms were simple, and in a twisted way, they sounded almost fair. His brother Ellison was still alive, being tended to by a doctor. Anse made a promise. If Ellison lived, the McCoy boys would be handed over to the law in Pikeville unharmed. They would face a judge and a jury. But if Ellison died, the boys would answer to Hatfield justice. The constables had no choice. They handed over the prisoners. The Hatfields cut the chains and bound the McCoy boys with rope. They were loaded onto the backs of horses, no longer prisoners of the state of Kentucky, but hostages of the Hatfield clan. They weren't taken to a jail. They were taken across the river, back into West Virginia, to an abandoned schoolhouse. They were tied up inside, a guard posted at the door. And then, they waited. They waited as the sun went down. They waited as the hours ticked by in the suffocating darkness. Their fate was not in their hands. It wasn't in a judge's hands. It was in the hands of a dying man a few miles away. Every breath Ellison Hatfield took was one more breath the McCoy boys were allowed to take. But that breath was getting shallower, and the night was getting long. The next 24 hours would become the stuff of legend and horror. While Devil Anse kept his vigil at his brother's bedside, the 3 McCoy boys sat in the dark, listening for the footsteps that would tell them their time was up. The word came at dawn. Ellison Hatfield was dead. The promise was broken. The sentence was passed. They were dragged from the schoolhouse, their hands still bound. It wasn't a quick march. They were forced on a long, winding path through the woods, back toward the Tug Fork River. Their last sight of Kentucky was from the wrong side of the river, a cruel reminder of the home they would never see again. Their destination was a small clearing, unremarkable except for a thick grove of pawpaw bushes, thin, pliable saplings that grew in clusters, not strong enough to be lumber, not beautiful enough to be admired, just there. This was not a back alley murder. It was a ceremony. They tied the boys to the pawpaw trees, Tolbert, the one who held the knife, in the middle. His 2 younger brothers, who had only joined the fight to help him, on either side. They were facing Kentucky, forced to look at the land they were dying for. Miles away, their mother, Sarah McCoy, was on her knees. She didn't know the details. She only knew her sons were gone. She prayed for their safe return. She prayed for mercy. She prayed that God would intervene. But God wasn't in that clearing. Devil Anse was. They didn't just shoot them. They executed them by lantern light while their mother prayed miles away. A firing squad of Hatfields lined up in the pre-dawn gloom. There were a dozen men, maybe more, each man with a rifle, each man a participant. This wasn't one man's sin, it was the collective sin of a clan. Ants gave the order. The sound was a single deafening roar that echoed off the hills. 50 guns, maybe more, all firing at once. For a fraction of a second, the entire valley was lit by a series of bright orange muzzle flashes. The bodies of the 3 McCoy boys were torn apart, held upright only by the ropes and the thin trees they were tied to. And then, silence. A silence more profound than the noise that came before it. The smell of gunpowder hung in the cold air. The Hatfields didn't cut the bodies down. They left them there, tied to the pawpaw bushes as a message, a warning. This is what happens when you shed Hatfield blood. The line had been crossed. There was no going back. This was no longer a feud over pigs or pride or politics. Randall McCoy's sons had been captured, kidnapped across state lines, and systematically executed by a firing squad without a trial. This was war. But then, a strange thing happened. After this explosion of unimaginable violence, nothing. The war that had just been declared went completely quiet. For 5 long years, an eerie silence fell over the Tug Fork Valley. The murders of the McCoy boys went unpunished. But this wasn't peace. It was the long, slow intake of breath before the final scream. The silence was the strangest part. After the savage brutality of the pawpaw bush executions, you would expect an immediate, bloody retaliation. You would expect Randall McCoy and his kin to storm across the river, guns blazing. But they didn't. The war that had just been declared went completely quiet. So why did it stop? Why the 5-year truce? The first reason was simple: terror. The executions were a masterpiece of psychological warfare. The Hatfields hadn't just killed 3 men, they had demonstrated overwhelming and ruthless force. They had proven they could kidnap men from the Kentucky authorities, execute them in broad daylight and suffer no consequences. The message was clear: we are the law here. Any McCoy who dared to seek revenge knew they weren't just fighting a family. They were fighting a private army that operated with complete impunity. The second reason was a legal black hole. The murders were a jurisdictional nightmare. The crime had started in Kentucky but ended in West Virginia. Kentucky lawmen had no authority to cross the river and arrest the Hatfields. And the West Virginia authorities? They had no interest in arresting Devil Anse Hatfield. He was one of them. He was a powerful businessman and a political force in Logan County. To them, it was just a family matter. The law, on both sides of the river, was paralyzed. And what about the victors? Devil Anse didn't celebrate. He retreated. He moved his family deeper into the mountains, building a new home that was more of a fortress than a farmhouse. He became more isolated, more wary. Maybe he was haunted by the ghosts of the boys he had ordered killed. Or maybe he understood that an act of that magnitude could never truly be over. He had won the battle, but he had started a war with no foreseeable end. And Randall McCoy, he was a broken man. Imagine it. You lose 3 sons in the most horrific way imaginable. You see their killers walking free across the river, living their lives, running their businesses, laughing with their children. Your wife, Sarah, falls into a deep depression, a walking ghost in her own home. The grief is an animal, a living thing that eats at your dinner table and sleeps in your bed. For 5 years, Randall McCoy did nothing but endure this. He stared across the Tug Fork, a man consumed by a toxic cocktail of sorrow and impotent rage. But that rage wasn't fading. It was hardening. It was transforming from a wildfire into a sharpened piece of steel. He knew he couldn't win a war of guns against the Hatfields. He had already lost that. So he started looking for a different kind of weapon. He was waiting, praying, not for peace, but for an ally. And in 1887, that ally finally appeared. A man with a law degree, a personal grudge, and the political power to do what Randall never could, turn the entire state of Kentucky into a weapon. The man who reignited the feud wasn't a Hatfield or a McCoy. He was a lawyer named Perry Cline. And he didn't want justice. He wanted revenge and land. Perry Cline was everything the Hatfields and McCoys were not. He wasn't a brawler or a farmer. He was a slick, ambitious political operator. A man who fought his battles in courtrooms and backrooms, not in dusty clearings. And he had a personal score to settle with Devil Anse Hatfield. Years earlier, Cline had been involved in a massive land dispute with Anse. It was a classic tale, the timber baron versus the local gentry. Cline claimed thousands of acres of valuable timberland. Devil Anse claimed it was his. In the end, Anse's power and influence won out. Cline was forced to sell his land at a fraction of its worth. He was humiliated and financially ruined by the Hatfield patriarch. He never forgot it. He moved away, built a new career as a lawyer and politician, and waited for his chance. He was also married to a McCoy. When a desperate Randall McCoy came to him in 1887, Perry Cline saw the perfect opportunity. He could use Randall's tragedy as a vehicle for his own personal vengeance. He would wrap his vendetta in the flag of justice. Cline used his political connections like a surgeon's scalpel. He went straight to the top, to the governor of Kentucky. He convinced him that the Hatfield clan was not just a family of killers, they were a sovereign threat to the state of Kentucky. They had invaded Kentucky soil, kidnapped its citizens, and murdered them. This was an affront to the state's honor. It was a brilliant political move. Suddenly, the cold cases of the Paw Paw Bush murders and the shooting of Ellison Hatfield were officially reopened. Indictments were issued for Devil Anse, his sons, Jim Vance, and 20 other men. But there was still the problem of the river. The indictments were just pieces of paper. They had no power in West Virginia. The Hatfields laughed them off. They were safe in their mountain fortress. So Perry Cline and the governor of Kentucky came up with a radical, legally questionable, and incredibly dangerous solution. They couldn't send the police, so they would send a bounty hunter. They put out a call for special officers, men who would be deputized by the state of Kentucky with one mission: to cross the river into West Virginia, hunt down the indicted Hatfields, and drag them back, dead or alive. This wasn't law enforcement. This was a state-sanctioned kidnapping squad, and they found the perfect man to lead it. His name was Frank Phillips. People called him Bad Frank. He was a ruthless, cold-blooded manhunter. He was known to shoot first and ask questions later. He hated the Hatfields with a passion that bordered on obsession. And now, the governor of Kentucky had just handed him a badge and a license to kill. The 5-year lull was over. The second phase of the war was about to begin, and it would be waged by a man who was more brutal and more dangerous than any of the men he was hired to hunt. Bad Frank Phillips didn't wait for permission. Armed with a state-issued warrant and a privately funded posse, he immediately launched a series of violent cross-border raids, turning the Tug Fork Valley into a full-blown war zone. He was a bloodhound given a scent. Winter nights in the Appalachians are absolute. The darkness is thick, heavy, and suffocating. And out of that darkness, Phillips and his men would materialize. They rode hard and fast, crossing the Tug Fork on moonless nights, their horses' hooves muffled by the dirt and snow. Their tactics were not the tactics of lawmen. They were the tactics of commandos. There was no polite knock on the door. There was the splintering wood of a kicked-in doorframe. There was the chaos of armed men storming into a sleeping cabin, the shouts of women and children, the cold click of a rifle hammer being pulled back in the dark. Phillips wasn't there to read anyone their rights. He was there to collect bodies. One by one, he started picking off the men on his list. He hauled them out of their beds, often in their nightshirts, and dragged them back across the river to a Kentucky jail. His raids were sudden, brutal, and terrifyingly effective. For the first time in years, the Hatfields were the ones who were afraid. They had operated with impunity, protected by the West Virginia border. Now, that border meant nothing. Bad Frank Phillips was a ghost who could cross it at will. He was a force of nature, and he was coming for them all. He wasn't a hero. He was just a Hatfield with a badge. The very terror tactics that Devil Anse had used to control the valley were now being used against him, sanctioned and funded by the state of Kentucky. The McCoys had found a monster to fight their monster. The pressure on Devil Anse was immense. His men were being captured. His family was terrified. His authority was crumbling. He was being hunted in his own home. He knew he couldn't win a war of attrition against a man with the state's resources behind him. Waiting and defending was a losing strategy. He had to do something decisive, something so shocking, so final, that it would break the will of his enemies and put an end to Frank Phillips's raids for good. He held a council of war with his most trusted men, including the old enforcer, Jim Vance. They concluded that Frank Phillips was just a weapon. The man aiming that weapon, the man who had sicked the law on them, was Randall McCoy. In their minds, Randall was the source of it all. Randall was the one who had conspired with Perry Cline. Randall was the one fueling the fire. If they could eliminate him, the heart of the opposition would stop beating. They decided that to kill the snake, they had to go for its head. And they believed the head of this new war was the old man who had been their enemy for decades. They chose the dead of winter, the night of New Year's Eve. They would not just cross the river to arrest a man, they would cross it to erase a bloodline. And so we return to where our story began, to the smoking ruins of a cabin in the snow. But now, we understand the why. This wasn't a random act of savagery. It was a calculated, desperate gambit in a war that had spiraled out of control. It was Jim Vance, the old warrior, who led the charge. Devil Anse was there, along with his son Cap Hatfield and a dozen others. They moved like shadows through the frozen woods, their faces grim in the moonlight. Their target, Randall McCoy's cabin. Their mission, leave no witnesses. They surrounded the house, they doused the roof in oil, and they set it ablaze. The plan was simple and horrific. The fire would act as a net, flushing the family out like animals from a burrow. As the McCoys ran from the flames, the Hatfield firing squad would pick them off, one by one, in the snowy clearing. Randall McCoy, as we know, was the first to run. He burst from the back of the house and sprinted for his life, gunshots chasing him into the darkness. He made it to the cornfield, then to a nearby pigsty, where he hid, listening to the nightmare unfold. Back at the cabin, the rest of the family was trapped. The front door was a wall of fire. The windows were death traps. Calvin, one of Randall's sons, tried to make a run for it. He was shot down before he took 5 steps. He fell into the snow, bleeding out, just feet from the inferno that had been his home. Then came the moment that would forever define the depravity of the feud. Alifair McCoy, Randall's daughter, stood in the doorway, framed by the fire. She screamed at the men in the darkness, "You've killed my brother! Let us be!" Jim Vance, the man who had likely murdered her uncle 20 years before, stepped out of the shadows. He raised his rifle. He didn't hesitate. He shot her. The bullet struck her in the chest. She collapsed onto the burning porch. Sarah McCoy, her mother, ran to her. She cradled her dying daughter's head in her lap, ignoring the flames that licked at her own dress. She was no longer a person. She was pure, primal grief. One of the raiders, a man named John C. Hatfield, the same John C. who had once courted Rosanna McCoy, ran forward, not to help. He raised the butt of his rifle and brought it down on Sarah's head with sickening force. The blow fractured her skull and left her for dead beside her daughter's body. The Hatfields lingered just long enough to ensure the house was completely consumed by the fire. They believed Randall was dead in the woods. They believed Sarah was dead in the yard. They believed the McCoy line was broken forever. Then they vanished back across the river, leaving behind a scene of carnage that would shock the nation. But they had failed. Randall was alive, and Sarah miraculously was not dead. She would survive, but she would be maimed for life, physically and emotionally. The Hatfields' great decisive strike, the one meant to end the war, had been a bloody, horrific tactical failure. They hadn't killed their enemy. They had martyred him. They had given Randall McCoy a story of suffering so profound, so undeniably evil, that it would galvanize the entire country to his cause. When the sun rose on the smoldering ashes and the frozen bodies, the story was no longer about a backwoods feud. It was about a massacre. And the headlines were about to turn this local war into a national crisis. The news of the New Year's massacre spread like wildfire. Newspapers from New York to San Francisco printed the gruesome details. And suddenly, the governors of 2 states were threatening to call up the militia and go to war with each other. The story was irresistible to the national press. It was a perfect storm of sensationalism. Savage mountain clans, a brutal massacre of women and children, and a Romeo and Juliet romance. It was a real-life dime novel, and America couldn't get enough. Reporters descended on the Tug Valley. They painted a picture of Appalachia as a land of uncivilized, bloodthirsty barbarians, a stain on the otherwise modernizing nation. The narrative was set. The McCoys were the tragic victims, and the Hatfields were the devil incarnate. This media firestorm put immense pressure on the governor of Kentucky, Simon Bolivar Buckner. He had sanctioned Frank Phillips's raids, and now this massacre had happened on his watch, on his soil. He had to respond, and he had to respond with force. He publicly condemned the invasion by the West Virginia bandits and declared that Kentucky would use all its power to bring the murderers to justice. He doubled the reward for the capture of Devil Anse and his men. He was, in effect, declaring open season on the Hatfield clan. But the governor of West Virginia, Willis Wilson, saw things very differently. In his view, Kentucky had been the aggressor. They had sent a hired killer, Frank Phillips, to illegally kidnap West Virginia citizens. The New Year's raid, he argued, was simply a tragic consequence of Kentucky's own lawlessness. He publicly denounced the Kentucky bounty hunters. He issued arrest warrants for Frank Phillips and his posse. He accused Kentucky of violating his state's sovereignty. Then he made a chilling threat. If any more Kentucky raiders crossed the Tug Fork, he would mobilize the West Virginia National Guard to repel them by force. Think about what was happening here. The governor of one U.S. state was threatening to send his state militia to engage in armed combat with the agents of another U.S. state. This wasn't just a feud anymore. This was a constitutional crisis. It was a standoff that echoed the same states' rights arguments that had torn the country apart just 25 years earlier. For a week in January 1888, the United States was closer to a second civil war than at any point since Appomattox. The federal government watched nervously. The entire country held its breath, waiting to see which side would blink first. But in the Tug Valley, they weren't waiting. They were arming. Frank Phillips, emboldened by the governor's support and public outrage, gathered the largest posse yet. He wasn't just hunting a few men anymore, he was leading an army. The Hatfields, now fugitives in their own home, fortified their positions. They were trapped, hunted, and desperate. They knew Phillips was coming for them, and they knew this would be their last stand. The final decisive battle of the Hatfield-McCoy War was about to be fought, not in a courtroom or a newspaper, but in a snowy ravine with rifles and shotguns. While the politicians postured, bad Frank Phillips was on the move. He had received a tip on the location of the Hatfield War Party. The climax of the feud would be a chaotic, desperate gunfight known as the Battle of Grapevine Creek. January 19th, 1888. A cold, grey morning. Frank Phillips and his posse of nearly 24 men moved silently through the snow-covered woods of West Virginia. Their target, a small cabin where the remnants of the Hatfield clan were holed up. Inside were Jim Vance, Cap Hatfield, and several other fugitives. They were cold, hungry, and paranoid. They knew they were being hunted. Devil Anse was not with them. He had gone deeper into hiding, a general separated from his last remaining soldiers. Phillips was a skilled tactician. This wasn't going to be a reckless charge. He split his men, sending one group to circle around the back of the cabin, cutting off any escape. He led the main force to a position on a wooded ridge overlooking the front. They were the hunters, and the trap was set. Imagine the silence. The only sound is the wind whistling through the bare winter trees. Phillips's men lie flat in the snow, rifles resting on frozen logs, sights trained on the cabin below. Every snap of a twig sounds like a gunshot. Then, a lookout in the cabin spots movement. A single rifle shot cracks from the cabin window, shattering the stillness, and all hell breaks loose. Phillips's men opened up with a coordinated volley of fire. The roar was continuous. Bullets chewed through the thin cabin walls, sending splinters flying like shrapnel. The Hatfields, trapped inside, returned fire blindly, smoke filling the small room. This wasn't a Hollywood shootout with clean shots and heroic stands. It was a desperate, ugly brawl. Men shouting, cursing, reloading as fast as their numb fingers would allow. Puffs of grey smoke dotted the hillside. Jim Vance, the old warrior, the man who had terrorized the valley for a generation, tried to rally the defense. He ran from window to window, directing fire. He was the heart of their resistance. Frank Phillips knew if he could take Vance down, the fight would be over. Vance made a mistake. He exposed himself in a doorway for just a second too long, trying to get a clear shot at the posse's position. Bad Frank didn't hesitate. His rifle was already aimed. One shot, one kill. The bullet hit Jim Vance, and the old man fell. The ghost of the feud was finally laid to rest, bleeding out on the floor of a bullet-riddled shack. With his death, the will to fight shattered. Cap Hatfield saw the situation was hopeless. He and the remaining fighters threw down their guns and fled out the back, running for their lives into the dense woods. Phillips' second group was there to meet them. The gunfight was over. Frank Phillips and his men descended on the cabin. Jim Vance was dead. 9 other Hatfield supporters were captured, their hands bound. They had broken the back of the Hatfield war machine. The guns of the feud had finally fallen silent. But the battle was far from over. It was simply moving to a new venue, the courtroom. The captured Hatfields were dragged back to Kentucky to face murder charges. But West Virginia wasn't giving up. The state filed a lawsuit that went all the way to the highest court in the land, turning a family feud into a landmark Supreme Court case. Imagine the scene. The men who had been captured at Grapevine Creek were no longer hostages in a schoolhouse. They were inmates in a Kentucky jail, facing trial for the murders of Alifair and Calvin McCoy at the New Year's massacre. But West Virginia's governor was furious. He argued that these men were not legal prisoners. They were kidnapped victims. They had been abducted from their home state by a hired thug, Bad Frank Phillips, in violation of the U.S. Constitution. He filed a petition directly with the federal government. The case, Mahon v. Justice, escalated with breathtaking speed. The central question was simple, yet profound. Does a state have the right to try a fugitive who was brought into its borders illegally? So who was right? Kentucky, which argued it had valid murder indictments and was simply bringing fugitives to justice? Or West Virginia, which argued its sovereignty had been violated by a state-sanctioned kidnapping? The case landed on the docket of the United States Supreme Court. Suddenly, this backwoods blood feud was being debated by the 9 most powerful legal minds in the country in the hallowed chambers of Washington, D.C. The fate of the Hatfield prisoners now rested on a fundamental question of American law. In 1888, the Supreme Court issued its ruling, and it was a thunderclap. The court ruled in favor of Kentucky. The decision stated that the power of a court to try a person for a crime is not impaired by the fact that he had been brought into the jurisdiction by force and without a proper warrant. In simple terms, the court said it didn't matter how the prisoners got there. It didn't matter if they were brought back in handcuffs or in a sack. All that mattered was that they were there, on Kentucky soil, and they had a valid indictment waiting for them. It was a cold, pragmatic ruling that set a legal precedent that stands to this day. And for the men in the Pikeville jail, it was a death sentence. With the Supreme Court's blessing, the trial began. The evidence was overwhelming. Multiple witnesses testified to the horrors of the New Year's massacre. The jury found them guilty. All were sentenced to life in prison, except for one, Ellison Cotton Top Mounts. He was believed to be an illegitimate son of Ellison Hatfield, and many accounts suggest he was intellectually disabled. He was a pawn, a follower, but witnesses claimed he was the one who fired the shot that killed Hatfield-McCoy. As the scapegoat, he was sentenced to hang. On a cold February morning, he was led to a makeshift gallows. A quiet crowd gathered to watch. His last words were a haunting, pathetic summary of the entire tragedy. He looked out at the crowd and said, "The Hatfields made me do it." The trapdoor fell. The final death of the Hatfield-McCoy feud wasn't from a Hatfield rifle or a McCoy knife, but from a hangman's rope, tied by the hand of the state. The war was officially over. The law had punished the soldiers. But what of the generals? With the violence over and the legal battle settled, only two men were left standing, the two kings, Randall McCoy and Devil Anse Hatfield. Randall died a broken man, haunted by the ghosts of his children. But Anse did something no one ever expected. Randall McCoy never recovered. He was a man hollowed out by grief. He had won the legal war, but he had lost everything that mattered. His home was a pile of ash. His wife was a shadow of her former self, permanently injured and mentally scarred. So many of his children were in the ground. He became a ghost, haunting the banks of the Tug Fork. He operated a small ferry for a time, a bitter, lonely man, ferrying people back and forth across the very river that separated him from his enemies. He was consumed by the past, a prisoner of his own memory. He died in 1914, not from a bullet, but from a fire. A simple cooking accident. It was a sad, quiet, and pathetic end for a man whose life had been defined by such violent noise. But what became of the man who had orchestrated so much of that violence? Devil Anse Hatfield was never arrested. He was never tried. He was too smart, too powerful, and too deep in the mountains for the law to ever reach him. As he grew older, a strange transformation began to occur. The man who had once been the embodiment of frontier vengeance, the man they called Devil, started looking for God. In 1911, at the age of 72, William Anderson Hatfield walked into the Tug Fork River, the same river that had been the border of his war, the same river that had carried his timber to market, the same river his enemies had crossed to hunt him. He was baptized. The image is almost impossible to comprehend. This giant of a man, this ruthless patriarch, this killer submitting himself to the waters of faith. Was it genuine repentance? A lifetime of sin finally catching up to him? Or was it the ultimate survival strategy? A final act of rebranding himself from a mountain warlord into a respectable, God-fearing elder? We will never know what was in his heart. But we know what happened next. Devil Anse lived out the rest of his days in peace and prosperity. He died in his bed in 1921, surrounded by his family. The man who ordered the execution of 3 boys tied to pawpaw bushes died at the age of 81, a respected member of his community. There is a famous photograph taken in the early 20th century. It shows 2 old men with long white beards sitting in chairs, staring at each other. One is Devil Anse Hatfield. The other is a McCoy relative. They are not fighting. They are not arguing. They are just 2 old men, survivors of a war that had consumed their world, now sitting in the quiet aftermath. It's a haunting image of a peace that came far too late for far too few. The men were gone, but the story was just beginning. The feud itself is dead, buried with its patriarchs. But the names Hatfield and McCoy have become immortal. The final question is why? What is the legacy of this brutal Appalachian war, and what does it tell us about ourselves? Today, the Tug Fork Valley is quiet. The sound of gunshots has been replaced by the hum of ATVs on tourist trails and the rustle of wind in the pawpaw trees. The physical reminders of the war are still there, if you know where to look. In a cemetery in West Virginia, a life-sized marble statue of Devil Anse Hatfield stands watch over his grave. It was commissioned by his children, a monument to a victor. He looks out over the valley he once ruled, a king even in death. Across the river, in Kentucky, Randall McCoy lies under a simple, broken stone. It's the grave of a man who lost, a testament to a life consumed by a war he couldn't win. The story of their conflict has outlived them both, but it has been warped and twisted by time. It has become a caricature, a comfortable lie we tell ourselves about ignorant hillbillies fighting over nothing. It's easier to laugh at a cartoon than to confront the uncomfortable truth, that this wasn't a story of good versus evil. It was a story of two proud, flawed families, trapped in a spiral of violence they couldn't escape. It was a story born from the trauma of the Civil War, a story fueled by poverty, political corruption, and the arrival of industrial forces that sought to exploit the land and its people. The feud was a symptom of a wounded nation struggling to define itself. But the story doesn't end with the graves and the jokes. In the year 2000, the descendants of these two families began to hold a joint reunion. They called it the Hatfield-McCoy Reunion Festival. The great-great-grandchildren of men who had slaughtered each other now gather every year for picnics, tug-of-war games, and shared history. In 2003, they signed an official truce, a symbolic gesture of peace broadcast on national television, a formal end to a war that had ended in fact, but not in spirit, over a century earlier. They chose to break the cycle, to prove that blood doesn't have to answer for blood forever. And maybe that is the true legacy of the feud. It's a cautionary tale etched into the American psyche. It reminds us how thin the line is between civilization and savagery, how quickly pride can turn to poison, and how grievances, when left to fester in the dark, can destroy generations. They fought over a pig, they fought over land, they fought over the honor of their name. But when you strip away all the myths and the gun smoke, you find a tragedy about the human condition. Two families staring at their own reflection across a river and hating what they saw.